Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Brandon Schulz, founder and CEO of Violet.io, a unified commerce API that integrates with the most popular e-commerce platforms in the world to get you to market quickly and effectively and efficiently. Brandon, I'm so excited to chat with you today and not only chat about what you've built at Violet, but also with the changes to e-commerce. As we were talking about the show, there's so much different ways to transact and so many new technologies, so many companies getting into the e-commerce space that haven't been in the space in particular in years past, but are seeing how they can get to their consumers quicker, help them transact at more velocity, higher transaction volumes, and all those kind of positive outcomes that really rely on the infrastructure in place, but also making sure that those things break, having consistent flow within their acquisition strategy and things like that. Before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
Good question. Before I started the company, I was technically a consultant. So I worked for a large consulting firm based out of Switzerland. I was working with Softbank Robotics and Starbucks and a bunch of others that were all solving a similar problem. So the simplest explanation is prior to starting Violet, I was in a situation in which I wish I had Violet and eventually realized someone had to build it. So I eventually quit my job and worked on building it with my best friend.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. It's one of a few kind of common, I would say, origin stories of founders was needing a tool that was really causing them either a lack of efficiency, more time, and things like that. What was essentially not having a tool like Violet when you were working with these companies that really, I guess, revitalized this interest in creating this product? Was it an efficiency? Was it missing a piece of technology? What in particular was limiting you with the resource you had? And what were you using at the time that was not giving you the capabilities that you wanted?
Yeah. So my answer is going to get a little bit like deep and technical inside of e-commerce, and for those that like understand e-commerce, that's great. But our very first attempt at trying to figure out how to build e-commerce integrations for a specific use case was at a company I co-founded a long time ago. But basically, we decided to build our own e-commerce stack on top of Broadleaf, which is an open source e-commerce platform. That alone, we probably wouldn't do that again. However, we learned a lot and we went through that process. It was very, very painful because you have the Broadleaf piece of the equation and then the integrations themselves, which are very detailed, very bespoke, and just require a lot of context. I then left that company, that sort of wrapped up. My co-founder moved on to work at Target on a very similar initiative. And there he was asked to build the exact same thing on the integration side of the house, but from scratch. And so he was going through that whole process. I was finding a similar problem. And the real question becomes, like, how is it possible for every company to have to build this from scratch in-house? And we were asked to do it. And every time we got asked to do it, it always took too long. It was too expensive. And it was actually the thing that caused the rest of the teams to struggle, right? We were spending so much time and money just trying to integrate that we weren't able to actually focus on building the user interface or optimizing marketing strategies or building important admin tools to help with customer experience. There's all these other things to actually run the business instead of having to just like plug into a socket like in the wall, which is ultimately what Violet is in some ways. And then Ren and I had to make kind of a strategic choice on how we think about the market to say, do we think these are literally sockets in the wall that need to exist inside of the digital world? And if that were the case, who's going to go build those for the e-commerce space? And that's when we decided to go start that company. So I'd maybe add, like it became an existential threat. And that's why we chose to make the jump. So it wasn't just, this is nice and everyone has to do this over and over again. There are things that every company has to do over and over again. This is what it is. But the actual calculation around how hard is this? How long does it take? How does it affect the business in various ways? It caused our prior company to fail. It caused other initiatives we were working on to fail. And it felt like a mission critical type of thing to solve. And so that's why we ultimately said, someone has to solve this. And we have been staring at it at that point for like 5 or 6 years. And we decided to do it ourselves.
Yeah. And what are some of the reasons that caused it to fail? Is it just the amount of resources into building this infrastructure and integration, or is it the lack of technical ability? Is there a small amount of people that know how to do this? What were some of the reasons behind companies not being able to actually integrate this and use it as a way to increase their business versus, unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way always?
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons that it all kind of comes together to cause the failure. It's not just one thing. It's not like it's just too hard or too complicated, right? We're not doing rocket science. Like You can, in theory, like send a rocket to the moon. Like that is doable. It just takes a lot of smart people and a lot of money. But that's not what this is. It's a combination of this not being the core offering of the company itself, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a company that's building a social commerce application, right? Let's say you're a social media app today, your core business is advertising. Your core business is recommendations and personalization and handling comments and serving up a feed and messaging and all these different tools and features. It's not trying to figure out how to handle the shipping API response from some random e-commerce platform that no one on your team understands. That's literally not the business they're in. And so it's always going to fall further down the prioritization stack, because at the highest level, there may be some executive out there that says, we think shoppers should be able to buy a product from inside of an app. That's great. But that's purely a user interface or user experience decision.
Yeah.
It is not a functionality or backend integration decision. And that one decision correlates to thousands of other decisions and a lot of work that's never going to work its way back up to that executive. And so they're always going to fall into like the sausage making, right, of the organization and end up lower on that prioritization list every single time. And so you end up with half solutions and workarounds and a tiny little thing. And I think the logic there is some combination of a last mile construct where all of this stuff doesn't work unless you have all 10 pieces in place. It's like a pipeline of sorts. You can't just build like one pipe and like put it out there and go, okay, we did like 10% of the pipeline, so it must have 10% functionality. No, not how it works. You have to do the entire distance of the pipeline to even get to say 10% works. That's just how it functions. But that's not how a lot of things in the internet work, right? Like I can go build a mobile app and build 10% of the functionality that I want in the future, and I can ship that, and it exists as a standalone entity. But that's not how this works. And so that strange sort of amalgamation of decision-making, prioritization, lack of knowledge, and that it's a data/pipeline product that has to cross a lot of different functionality over time makes it really, really hard. And we felt that firsthand 2 or 3 different times, and ultimately felt like in some ways out of empathy, we don't want anyone else to feel this. How can we make it possible that this particular experience doesn't exist for other people? And that was really why we started the company.
Yeah. And what would you say some of the signals are for companies looking to build an e-commerce arm of their business? I think a lot of people think about, oh, okay, I want to maybe sell something, then I set up an e-commerce store. But from what you're saying, it's a lot of brands that are already established that are looking just at another way or another vehicle to transact with their customers and make it easy and seamless. What are some of the signals that they see to be able to invest in that arm, seeing that now I'm sure more companies are becoming wise about how much it actually takes to invest, how much not only technical resources, but cost? What kind of pushes them over the edge? What are some of the reasons you've seen for them to develop this arm?
Yeah. So, I mean, e-commerce is not a small industry, obviously. A multi-trillion-dollar space. And for context, I think some numbers recently I read today, buy now, pay later as an industry is 5.3% for whatever of e-commerce globally.
Yeah.
That 5.3% feels really small, but that's $486 billion a year, right? That's like almost the entirety of the digital advertising space.
Yeah.
It's a massive, massive market, and it's a sliver of e-commerce. And so just being able to make a tiny splash is a huge, huge opportunity. And so we sort of look at that and recognize that e-commerce is growing. It's super interesting. And there are companies that categorically have products to sell. They go spin up a Shopify store or a Magento store, which I think is now Adobe Commerce. Everyone's changing names and stacks. It's hard to keep up, which is our job. But there are those companies. And I think it's been really, really cool to see the whole like Arm the Rebels movement, which was a general trajectory from giant retailers in the physical world to giant marketplaces on the internet like Amazon, to those retailers now hopping onto the internet, down to individual big stores, down to mid-market and smaller, and now eventually small entrepreneurs being able to stand up their own shop and go D2C and own their marketing channels and really democratize access to the tool set that a lot of the big guys have, and giving that to basically everyone, which is really, really cool. I think interesting movement.
Yeah.
On the other side of that equation is everyone else who doesn't have a product to sell.
Yeah.
Like I don't make products. I make software products. I don't make other products that people can sell. Right? Like if I could, I would love it. I'd love to be a candle maker. I know it's super random, but I am obsessed with candles. I buy candles all the time. I'm in a store. My fiance says this to me: "Are we going to walk out of here with another candle?" Probably.
Probably.
Yeah, but there is someone out there who is a candle maker, and they're going to use some sort of tool set. But what I know how to do is I know how to build really cool products and applications. And ideally, I would much prefer to say, okay, hang on a second. I want to take the skills that I have and the things that I do best and figure out how I can take that and get into a really lucrative market and try to do what I do, which is be an entrepreneur, build a product. Right? And there are a lot of people like me out there. A lot of people who have a product background, or they're engineers by day and actually can either code in Swift or use React. We even have current customers that are using like Flutter and some of the more like no code tools. And there's all these options out there. And in an alternate universe, I would take my love of candles and I would say, I'm going to create the best candle recommendation app in the world. And I'm going to go pick my top 10 or my top 20 candle companies that I really like. And I'm going to build a mobile app or something so that at any given time, someone can pull up my app and either identify a moment or a mood or an experience or a sprint, and then get a set of candles recommended back with some set or series of information.
Yeah.
Right? There are a lot of people out there that can build all kinds of cool apps. And I'm lucky enough that I get to see them using Violet, but they're saying to themselves, the era or the age of just going to some giant marketplace website and having to type into a search filter to find some product is slowly going to take less and less of a portion of the e-commerce transaction ecosystem. Yeah. It'll always be there. It'll always be a lot, obviously, but it doesn't have to be 50%, right? If that 50% were to go down to 40%, you're talking like $900 billion. That's up for grabs, basically.
Yeah.
And figuring out what that process looks like. And ultimately, Violet serves as an API middleware for any app developer, any product manager, any company that has an audience, is able to aggregate people and provide useful information and the opportunity for someone to purchase a product, to not have to build any of their integrations. And in fact, to stand all of that up in like a couple of business days. That's what that is. So it's really powerful and really interesting, but it is a redistribution. So whereas the first portion of the movement was the democratization of the tools, Violet is now attempting to redistribute some of those tools to net new entities and parties that are adding value to that ecosystem in support of shoppers and merchants.
Yeah. And thinking about obviously this shift and this transition, whether it's transactions or even eyeballs or things like that, one thing that comes to mind is, what does it mean towards the standards of a customer's experience? Meaning that you've had this huge influx and huge enterprises like Amazon creating this very simplistic user experience that I think for a lot of people who say don't want to buy anything on Amazon because whether it's a quality or maybe it's an attachment or whatever, they don't have a similar philosophy. People have there's a lot of behaviors that help people decide, but what does it mean in terms of their expectations for a user experience? Say you're that candle maker, building this online store, building this recommendation engine. It's not necessarily about what technology should I have to make me modern, but it's about what are the standards that I have to comply to for people to complete a transaction. How have you seen that really become prevalent, and what are those standards for these companies or brands or people who want to build these stores who necessarily need to comply to be even competitive? Because now it's not about the product. Now it's not about the mission. Now it's about getting to your audience and helping them easily transact. Describe the standards and how they've affected e-commerce in the more recent years.
Yeah, like our core premise based on our experience is that the experience inside of any application or experience should be exactly the same as the experience that a shopper would get from that merchant's website. And in order to pull that off, you have to have a lot of data synced between those different systems, and you have to have that data synced basically in real time. Without that, to your point, you're going to start to see a degradation in experience. So you're going to have items that aren't the right price. You're going to be selling items that are out of stock. You won't know how to calculate the shipping the shipping price, or even how to charge taxes if you have to, all the way down to handling refunds and returns and fulfillments and all the notices that are necessary. A lot of marketplace technology in the past has been built in-house and has always been around custom, big, large, gnarly efforts. And in reality, a lot of that information already exists, right? Merchants are setting that up in their Shopify store. They have their own negotiations and agreements that they're making with a bunch of third-party logistics providers and are very comfortable with the paradigms. A lot of that stuff already exists. So ultimately, if there was a tool that was able to bring parity between those two experiences, then again, you could just focus on running your business. You have all the data necessary to build that customer experience that you want, but ultimately, you're not having to do it separately. The merchant's not having to shuttle data back and forth manually with like CSV uploads or clicking buttons for every order. That should all go away, but it hasn't. That's just how it works today. We've worked with many customers over the last decade that force people to do all of that manually, clicking buttons back and forth. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't scale. And ultimately, we think that needs to be resolved. But to your point, with that focus on customer experience, and the customer experience question is actually a data question, and the data question is an API question. And that's where we chose to build a product.
I love how it kind of influences and kind of how you described how every kind of point, decision, or even expectation kind of influences the technology on the back end. And even just to ask, obviously it might be a little too high level for most of us, but what is the tech stack that's necessary if I'm building an e-commerce company or building something around a brand, some way I want to connect clients with the product or customers with the product? What are the most important things that I need that Violet makes easy for me to build and integrate? Not to get somebody's secret sauce, but to get somebody's secret sauce.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't care. The real answer is that if you're wanting to build a next generation e-commerce experience, right? Like you don't have candles in your back room somewhere that you're trying to sell, but you do want to sell candles because other people have them. And you want to do so in a very connected way, not like an old school drop shipping.
I was going to ask.
Model. But if you want it to be more customer interaction, kind of a three-way transaction, if that's the case, you really only need Violet. Like that's kind of all you need. Prior to Violet, you needed a bunch of things. So you would have had to build your own front-end application, probably in iOS or a React web app of some sort. Maybe you decide to run it on Shopify. Maybe you decide to connect it to some e-commerce platform. Maybe not. You probably would then spin up your own paradigm for orders and build your own databases and like build your own e-commerce website from scratch. It's a lot of work. Seen it done. And then once that's up, you have to connect that to each individual e-commerce platform. So you can say, okay, this candle maker wants to sell products in my app. I need to figure out how to connect my servers to their servers. And they would say, okay, I'm on Shopify. And so you would have to go and build an integration in some set of microservices that connect their system to your system at some interval with some sort of data mapping and taxonomy, then get that into your system, make sure it's working, stays up to date, you're consuming all the webhooks. Pretty complicated for just one integration. Then another candle maker wants to sell products and they're on Adobe Commerce, which is an entirely different paradigm. And none of what you did on Shopify applies to that one. And so you basically start over and build number two. All of that would exist for every new platform that the candle maker is on if you were to continue and grow it over time. Or you just use Violet and you can make whatever choices you want on your front end. You can have your own database if you like. You can put it into an e-commerce platform. We don't care. But you get a simple, almost like Stripe-like API, Stripe or Plaid probably for comparison. And you can pull that in. And in fact, we actually just released our first like full-fledged demo app. We have a JavaScript SDK as a part of that. You can go grab our NPM package for all the devs that are listening. But you can grab that, spin that up, and sure, go ahead and customize some of the CSS, et cetera. But in probably an hour or two, you would have a full-fledged multi-merchant checkout web app that you can use for whatever you want. You can throw video onto it. You can just build your own marketplace if you like. You can wire it into some new experience that you're building on the web, doesn't really matter to us, but it's all there. All of it's been built, a couple lines of code to kind of swap it over. But I think that's kind of the power here, is that all of that work, six years now at Violet, 10 plus years of time and experience figuring out how all this stuff works, gets to sort of compile down into, again, a couple lines of code, and is ready for someone to add e-commerce to whatever business they're building.
Yeah. And just give us more context. And to add to that, what's been exciting about the traction you've seen up to this point now? And what's particularly excited about what you've seen in terms of the outcomes that Violet is able to deliver for people wanting to build these stores, or even large companies wanting to build these stores? What's exciting about the traction? And if you have any numbers, obviously it'd be awesome. But also, what's particularly exciting about the predictive outcomes that you're able to give your customers?
Totally. So first thing that's really exciting for us is that people finally care about this. When we started the company, this wasn't a thing. Like, no one cared about e-commerce infrastructure. And for years on end, we were building a pipeline effectively that we knew and thought was going to be really important in the future. But it wasn't until like late 2021, early 2022, when things really started to catch fire and everyone realized, oh, there's a lot going on here and we need more help. And here's kind of the next phase or series of things people are going to build in e-commerce. That's been super exciting for us. It feels like we finally have all sort of arrived to stare at the same thing and found the same need. So that's really fun for us. We don't share specific numbers today about the growth of the business, but I'd say I am just thrilled at what I get to do every day, because I get to help other companies be successful and build whole sections of their business, whole revenue models they didn't know were even possible or could exist. And we get to operate as an extension of their team. It's almost like they're e-commerce experts in some way, and just get to make their lives easier. And that's really, really enjoyable for us. In terms of the predictive outcome, we have some customers who were already trying to get into e-commerce, trying to do some checkout stuff, but they were doing a lot of it manually. For those customers that were doing what we would call manual reordering, we've been able to save them a 95% reduction in costs for order processing, and to take some of the duration of an order process down from 36 hours to like 300 milliseconds, for example. And so really intense adjustments because of just the power of automation, right? Like, software's really powerful. And if you can build the entirety of everything that you need and package it really, really well, then you can start to do new and interesting things. So that's really fun for us. I think we're still just getting started. I know everyone says that, and I can't stand that phrase anymore. But I think we've, as a company, been focused on the infrastructure and getting the tech right and getting the API to support all the features that we need. And we're now starting to see some more consistency around use cases, and we're starting to see different geographies starting to surface. And so we have so much fun stuff to build in the future. See a lot of really interesting ways to expand, both on the product side and in terms of geography. So we're very excited, but again, we got a lot of work to do. We got a long road ahead.
Yeah. Thinking about whether it's external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that you see Violet facing today?
Yeah. I mean, there's always a risk that the market continues to have a downturn of sorts. I don't know exactly how that impacts Violet per se.
Sure.
Thus far, most things that have been negative in the market have been reasonably positive for us, only because we're a startup, luckily, right? So generally, the market is always something to consider. Outside of that, there aren't a lot of risks for us as a company. I do think there is an open question around, what does purchasing look like in the future? Today, purchasing is centered around some sort of mobile app or website. And you're going to fill out a form, and then maybe you save that, but that's what purchasing looks like. What I don't think has been solved is, what does it look like to buy a product in virtual reality? No one has clearly defined, here's the paradigm. Or maybe there isn't a paradigm. Maybe it's blinking your eyes 3 times. Like, maybe it's something totally novel, but that requires a certain set of infrastructure and connections to systems and all these different ways that we need to be able to transact in various interfaces and technical stacks. And that's not going to go away. So I think that unknown is still an open question for us. It's an exciting one, but it is an unknown. And it's one of the things we are continuing to try to get out in front of, find people who are building great products in the space and give them the tools to be creative, be the experts in their space, and build and innovate in a way that we can all kind of look on with awe and see the next phase emerge right in front of us.
Yeah. And if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for the company?
Same as every company, grow a great product and solve a lot of problems. Hopefully we get a chance to grow our overall market cap. I think long term, I'd love to see some of our early employees really benefit from that growth. And then if it makes sense to IPO or whatever else, want to make sure that the people who are investing with their time in the company today are able to get that back out, and also to be an option on the public markets so that regular investors and even folks who use Robinhood have a chance to invest, because there's so much upside that is realized in the private market that isn't always realized in the public market. So I think for us, it's more just around continuing to build a great company and great product, and slowly figuring out what it looks like for Violet specifically to find its legs and get into that next phase of growth.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this next section. I love this next section, actually. I call my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where it gets. So I always like to start out with this one, just to make it ease our way into it. But what's particularly hard about your job day to day?
My job day to day is difficult because Violet touches a lot of different disciplines across a lot of different use cases. So we have to interface with merchants and channels, and those merchants and channels could be using e-commerce platforms across any specific system, or the channel could be in VR or video or whatever it is. So the context switching around, okay, what are we talking about? What's the problem to be solved? And how do I get deep and then come back out to be helpful as fast as possible is really challenging. So I'm working hard actually trying to figure out how can I speed that up and build that more as a muscle.
Yeah. Thinking about ways that the product works in particular, and the capabilities it can allow not only an individual user, but across multiple users. As a founder, where do you spend a lot of time focusing on in terms of client acquisition? Are you focusing on partnerships, kind of landing and expanding, working with a brand like Target and kind of increasing its capabilities within the platform, or new logos, assigning more, or essentially getting more people who want to build these marketplaces onto the platform and enabling them to build more stores? What are you particularly focusing on, and what do you think has the most value at this point in time? Obviously, product market fit changes as the day and night changes, or as the seasons, as the weather. But in particular, right now, what do you think is the right kind of focus for your company? Is it land and expand? Is it new acquisition? Is it something else?
Yeah, for us, we focus on channels. So we got to interact with people who are building these new experiences. That's our kind of primary focus today. And then ensuring that whatever we're building aligns to that new logo acquisition, what their needs and their requirements are. And inevitably that does involve merchants or the supply side of that equation.
Yeah.
Because of that, there is some element of figuring out how to support both entities and what their interaction looks like. But it's ultimately like a tooling, some combination of tooling. And I really like the fact that as a founder, I get to be really, really close to product and sales, because those two have to stay in sync. Like you can't be having a lot of feedback from customers and not integrating that into your roadmap. It's just the most basic thing in the world. And vice versa. You can't be building stuff and not getting feedback and finding out that it's not useful or it was game changing. You need to continue to advance on that. So that's really where we're at today. It's about making sure we interface as often as possible with customers and prospective customers through the lens of how helpful is this? What's the next small thing we can add? And I think that's been probably the most surprising thing to us, is just how many cool and different things there is to build and how important the product is for people. And I don't know. I just love my job, so I can get quite excited.
Yeah. What's been surprising that someone's built using your platform?
I think the one that surprised us most right off the bat was a gifting platform for influencers. So influencers can go and create their own gifting wish list and share that wish list with their audience, and their audience will then buy them products. And it can be around a birthday or a wedding or Valentine's Day or whatever it is. But you go in and you shop and you select the products and you purchase it and send a note. And then there's this like social connection, and they mention them in the stream or on the next post or whatever that is. I didn't even know that was a business. I could have never guessed it would have been a business, but it's a real sizable and growing business, and it's fascinating. And all the different ways that creator commerce is evolving, how some companies are just focusing on search and trying to specialize on the search part of e-commerce and building that into a product. down to product recommendations. And it's just, there are so many different ways to slice this, and they've all been rolled into these giant marketplaces, and seeing people starting to split them out and do one part really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about also Web3 and how this is impacting your company. People are starting to use digital wallets, self-custody or custodial wallets, and using and wanting more ways to transact and not only be paid for services, but also buy products and use that as actual active liquid income. How is some of the capabilities of Web3 impacted your company? Is there an integration piece that you've had to build because of it? Is there something in the future that you think will impact the business? What about this new movement of decentralized commerce has really made you change the way you think about building the business or not?
Yeah, our business in general is trying to stay pretty modular as much as possible. So that payment piece is really just another modular component. So whether someone wants to pay or use a particular Web3 wallet, or they want to pay with their PayPal account or whatever that might be, we just need to make sure that it's easy to use whatever products they want to use.
Yeah.
That's kind of our core business model. So whether that's through Stripe or other providers, I'd say it's something we support, but it's not our primary driver. We've been pretty insulated from the boom and bust on both sides of that equation, again, allowing us to focus on the part that we do best, which is just the API integration between those platforms and whatever someone wants to build.
Yeah. Thinking about ways to kind of build culture, obviously a lot of founders are thinking about working with remote, hybrid, and even in office teams and maintaining just like a singular focus on what to build and the direction you go. What are some things as a company you've built internally to help reinvigorate or reinvest in, or even just acknowledge culture on a day-to-day basis? And how does that actually impact your outcomes as a business in a positive way, if they do? And if not, interested to hear you respond to that.
Yeah, I believe that culture is really about common expectations. So what expectations does everyone hold and share that may not be explicit, but are unwritten rules? Because we can't write a rule for every individual scenario that we may experience, but ideally we have some general expectation of the direction we expect or hope the interaction or the conversation or the output to go in. That is how I define culture. Yeah. For us, we then have identified 5 key sort of cultural values that are pretty all-encompassing. We didn't want to have too many. We wanted them to be easy to remember. You could rattle them off on one hand, and we have 5. And then we intentionally are always trying to unfurl each of those within actual interactions. So as a team, we try to refer to those as often as possible in plain language. So our 5 core values are clarity, curiosity, empathy, rigor, and integration. Those are our 5. And in any interaction, we pause. And if there's something missing, we go back to those 5, and someone will say, okay, why are we not quite getting this? Is there a lack of clarity? Do I need to be more curious? Am I not being empathetic enough? Is there a lack of empathy on the other side of this equation?
Sure.
Do we need to add some rigor and attention to detail or whatever that is? But then we can come back to that and see like, got it. Here's what I missed. I wasn't as clear as I should have been. And I want to go back, and ideally I'd like to take another pass at clarity on this and come back to you and go, yep, sounds great. No worries. But it again builds that common language and shared expectation, which helps us big time as a company and helps us move very, very fast.
Yeah. And also, I can see that it impacts maybe even a similar experience with your customer base, right? It's having that kind of predictive focal point or even like checklists of items on how you're managing a situation that from a customer standpoint feels consistent across the board, which is awesome. And I think a lot of companies are not only seeing how culture impacts internally, but also externally and what that means for how they're viewed as a brand. Yeah. One thing I like to always ask is, what's something that you're good at now as a founder that you wish you were better at earlier on?
Good question. I am much better at taking a deep breath and letting the situation sort of slide past and then being able to figure out how to respond. Like there are so many times in my past when I would have probably overreacted or miscalculated a scenario. And at some point, there's just so many really intense things happening as a founder that you realize you don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that anymore. And as a result, it turns into a skill. And we talk a lot about it as a company, the amount of time from the impetus of the action to when it hits our brains, and we then act on the way it is interpreted within our brains. And I've gotten a lot better at, okay, I'm going to receive this information. I'm going to hold, I'm going to pause what's happening in my body, what's happening in the situation, how are we relating, what are they feeling? And then starting to kind of inch my way into, how do I want to respond to this?
Yeah.
I wish I was a lot better at that earlier in my career, but it's very hard for a long time.
Yeah. I love to ask this next question because I love how founders extract knowledge out of anything that they ingest, whether it was early in your career or now. What books or people or advice has impacted or influenced your day-to-day, even now, the most?
To be honest, what has impacted my day-to-day is the development of my thinking patterns. And this is a little bit of baseball here, but I decided to join the debate team my junior year in college. And that process was probably the most formative thing I did. I got demolished for a long time in debate and realized a lot of things, but one of which was I'm wrong a lot. And figuring out how I'm wrong is so important. It's way more important than being right. And I say this to the team all the time. I don't care if you're wrong. I just care how long you stay wrong. That's it. And that debate thing is what helped me. And I ended up just writing out every argument, every speech people were giving, all the concepts, how they all relate, why that particular proof made sense or didn't make sense. And didn't care as much about the technique really, but wanted to say, if I were to have to communicate this exact same concept to someone on the street, could I recreate a bulletproof argument to say why that is true, regardless of whether I believed it? Had nothing to do with where I stood personally. It was, can I recreate this in a sound fashion? Which was ultimately building it. And I did that hundreds and hundreds of times. And now when I'm working on stuff, those muscles are there. And so something pops up and I can just pull those and sort and figure out and identify, and we're able to slide through. And so I'm just so thankful and grateful I got to do that. But now it's hard to go back. It's hard to recreate. It was a certain moment in time. And I'm really thankful that I was in a place where I could take advantage of that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to see how it directly translates into, business, right? And even relationships overall. It's understanding maybe an outcome, a value, or something that's going to affect a cause and effect of a situation, and just laying out the facts and identifying what are we facing, what are the opportunities and options, what have we thought about, what's available, and what are our potential outcomes that we could recreate or create ourselves out of thin air. That's so fascinating because it directly in line to it. I'm sure your thought process as a founder and how you go through decisions, how you identify signals, and creating the validity behind the I'm sure the strategies that you deploy within your team. So exciting to see how that kind of really impacted you in your company. And in addition to that anecdote, any books or materials, online podcasts, where do you gather your information, and where are you kind of keeping your ear to the ground outside of what you're building at Violet, which I'm sure you're deep into changes and software and updates and how things integrate. But outside of that, where do you kind of stay in touch and rejuvenate or gather more information?
About any particular topic
anything.
Anything. I spend a lot of time in podcasts. I'm fairly addicted to a whole series of podcasts. And I'm a little bit of a completist, so I'm trying to always stay on every single episode of certain podcasts. I also read books via Audible as often as possible. So that's a huge source for me based on certain categories. And then outside of that, I think there are a couple of thinkers that structure their thoughts really well. I don't always agree with all of their concepts, but I'm ultimately looking for who's able to lay out the discussion in the most interesting way and frame things or provide hooks in places where I wouldn't have expected a hook to be. That's what I'm looking for. So I think Ezra Klein does a really good job of that generally. And there's a few others out there, but I think he does a good job. He brings in others also who are fantastic at that as well, trying to deal with particular questions, etc. I'd say his AI series is especially good. But yeah, that's largely where I go. But the books and everything will kind of run the gamut.
Yeah, I always like to add, I know we're coming to the close of the show, and I definitely want to give you a chance to give us your plugs and where you can find you. But before we get into all that, Is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have? Is there anything that we didn't talk about that we should have brought up? Anything that we left on the table here for the audience? Anything come to mind at all?
No, I think we're good. This has been enjoyable.
I love that, Brandon. And last little bit is, where can we find you? Where can we be a fan of you? Give us your Twitters, your LinkedIn's, your Instagram, wherever we can congregate and identify and support you as a founder.
Totally. I mean, the Violet website is the biggest. So violet.io, you can go there anytime. You can also find me on Twitter, Brandon_Schulz, and find all the other necessary links. And of course on LinkedIn, just under my name, you can find everything there. And I probably post most frequently on LinkedIn. So if you want to stay up on the conversation, go find me there, and you'll see a lot more posts around e-commerce trends and kind of how to find your way into this next phase of e-commerce.
Amazing. Brandon, it's been such a pleasure not only learning about how you got into building Violet, the pains that you were seeing earlier and even later in your career, the decision to start building it, and how it's able to not only transform people in their individual businesses, but also large companies, and how they really can create this impressive arm to address their customers, deliver, transact, and all these beautiful things that come out of this e-commerce landscape, not only from an individual level, but from a company level. It'll be exciting to see where this grows and expands to, and how it impacts a lot more products that I'm sure I'll be interfacing with, but might not even know that are hosted by Violet. So again, Brandon, such a pleasure having you on the show. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thank you again for being on Behind Company Lines today.
That's great. Thanks for having me.
Of course.